Hey guys, Tad here with KiS Organics, and today I want to talk to you about organic amendments and organic inputs. What I have in front of me here is the majority of things that you'll find in organic fertilizers. I'm going to talk about each one sort of off the cuff. I'm not reading a script, so I may not catch all the bullet points that I want to, but I will try and add any notes as well as the actual NPK. The nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium of the various products that I'm talking about. I'll add those to the video later because I don't have those all memorized. So I'm just gonna run through them. This is gonna be one really long form video. I'm gonna try and bookmark the different spots so you can look up particular amendments if you're curious about them. And initially what I have out right now is all things that contain NPK. So these are gonna be your major nutrients. I'll do another one with calcium and limes, as well as micronutrients. I'll do one on compost, and I'll do one on some blended fertilizers. So it's a lot, and I only had so much room in front of me. And a lot of these things look very similar, so bear with me as I try and go through them. Now, before I do, one of the first things I want you to think about when you're thinking about organic fertilizers is release rates. And one of the primary variables with release rates is particle size and solubility. So some of these things are going to have very large particle size, like this neem seed meal or neem cake, versus, I don't know, something like this potassium sulfate or Epsom salt, magnesium sulfate, fully soluble in water. Or even if we're talking particle size, like this kelp meal is very, very fine. And I've seen kelp meals come in a variety of different particle sizes. So the smaller the particle size, the greater the surface area, and the easier it is for microbes to break them down and make them plant available. Now, this is a very general, broad statement that I'm making. There's some nuance to it. There's a lot of variables that will come into play, like what microbes are in your soil, what moisture levels are in your soil, what temperature is your soil. All those things are going to play a role in terms of nutrient availability. But that's the first thing I look at or think about when I'm looking at an organic amendment. Before I look at NPK, I look at particle size. So keep that in mind. But let's start off talking about primarily nitrogen amendments. So what I have closest to me here first is organic alfalfa meal. Now, organic alfalfa meal is something that I like to use in all of my nitrogen recommendations. It doesn't contain a lot of nitrogen, so you're not getting a lot of NPK out of it per se, but it's a wonderful microbial food. It feeds bacteria, archaea, fungi, which in turn will feed protozoa and other microorganisms. So if you're big on the soil food web thing, adding organic alfalfa meal is a great option for you. Just be careful, because if you add too much, it can cause the soil temperature to heat up as the bacteria reproduce rapidly, and that could potentially pull nitrogen from your crop roots or potentially cause issues in that regard. But in general, it's a really good, safe amendment to use, and something that I like to use in all of my gardens. Okay, moving on. So next, what I have here, I believe this is the fish meal. So fish meal, it's primarily nitrogen. It's derived from fish, as you may know, and it's a fairly small particle size here. It's one of the more expensive nitrogen options. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just you're going to pay more for your nitrogen if you go with fish meal. Some people prefer ocean-based products over things that might have come from our industrial slaughterhouses and things like that. But in terms of cleanliness of the product, heavy metals, exposure to, I don't know, growth hormones, chemicals, things like that, it's not necessarily any cleaner. So keep that in mind, because I have heard some organic companies pushing that sort of message and agenda, and it just, the science doesn't back it up. So if you want to learn more about that, you can go and take a look at a video I made on exactly that topic. I'll try to link to it in the comments. But again, fish meal, primarily nitrogen. And so if you're looking to make something that is Not using things like blood meal, feather meal, that is a good other nitrogen source option. Okay, next I have soybean meal. So soy meal is a great option for folks who want to create sort of a vegetarian or vegan mix, or don't want to support our industrial fishery, commercial fishing, or industrial slaughterhouse, loops of food production for our country. So if you do want to use only plant-based inputs, that's a great source for nitrogen. So you could use something like the soy and the alfalfa meal. Keep in mind with any of the plant-based nutrient sources that they can vary based on the fertility of the soil, and how that crop was grown will impact the fertility of the final product itself. So you may see some variability there, but you can usually get a pretty rough idea by looking at the label as to what you're actually getting for nitrogen. But just keep in mind those labels are not 100% accurate. So if you're using those and purely those for calculating out what your NPK is going to be, I can tell you right now, it's not going to match up the way you think it is. We always soil test afterwards and are always shocked with just how different it is when we start mixing and making soils from what we expect using an NPK calculator. Okay, moving on. Neem cake or neem seed meal. The one that we have right now, this is in the form of a pellet, a compressed pellet, but you can also get it, at least we've got in the past, as like a powder. One of the things about the neem cake is it's the residue that's left after the seed is pressed to extract the oil. So depending on how thoroughly they press the seed, that will determine what azadirachtin content may be left in the neem seed meal. And azadirachtin is a insect growth regulator. There's synthetic versions like Azamax or Azatrol that you may have heard of. Some people like to use neem oil as a foliar spray to deal with various insects. I have used the neem seed meal in the past. It's been a number of years now because I think there's better options out there, but I have used it at a rate of 2 cups per 5 gallons of water that I bubbled for 24 hours and then watered over the soil to deal with a really bad fungus gnat infection that I had at the time, or infestation. So it can be used for that. It is going to give you a little bit of nitrogen, but there's a couple reasons why I tend to not use as much neem cake and also the Karanja cake, which I'll talk about next. And that's sort of twofold. So the first reason, and again, all of this goes back to using the Coots mix and Clackamas Coot back in the day. But the reasons I moved away from these, and I still use a small amount, but very small amount compared to what Coots mix was or what I originally used. And the reason why is one, the fossil fuel cost. So just to get the product here, to get the neem cake here from India is very expensive, and it has a high fossil fuel cost to do so. I just think there's better nitrogen options out here on this table that are more sustainable because I can source them more locally. I did hear there was going to be some neem production happening in Florida, which potentially would be a little closer. And again, I'm making this video like you live and are sourcing things in the United States or let's say North America. If you live in India, neem cake is a wonderful option for you for getting nitrogen. It's been used for, I think hundreds, if not thousands of years by farmers for cultivation of crops. So moving on, the second reason, and this goes for both of these, is from talking to a good friend of mine. She was consulting with a farm in Oregon, and they actually failed for a pesticide that is a chemistry that has not been allowed in the United States since the 1970s. And so this farm was very confused as to how they could have failed on their flower for this pesticide. And basically what had happened, as they tracked it all down, was the neem oil that they were spraying on their crop contained low trace levels of this particular pesticide. I don't remember what the pesticide was off the top of my head, but I know that it's not something that's been available here in the United States for 40 years now, 50 years almost. So the fact that it was on the crop pretty much means that the farmers that were growing the neem tree somewhere in that production chain it got exposed to this pesticide. So That's something with the neem cake, the karanja cake, that's just something to be aware of as a possibility, and it's one reason to have a very clean source, but also realize that, like I said, there's better options we can find here locally. Okay, moving on. This is probably my favorite amendment right now that I like to include in all of my gardens and all of my soil formulations, and this is insect frass. Now, the great thing about insect frass, well, there's a number of things, really. The first one being is it's closing an ecological loop. So a lot of times these mealworms are eating a waste byproduct and then converting that into grubs, which are then sold as a high protein source for animal feeds. And then this frass is their poop and leftover exoskeletons, anything that remains there. And the wonderful thing about insect frass is I have yet to see a sample, and I've probably looked at 3 or 4 different sources now over the years, and all of them have been very clean on heavy metals. Now, in addition to the low heavy metals, which is really big for those of you that are in regulated states growing cannabis, but even for people with our own gardens, just for our own health, having something that's really clean, that is has nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and it's kind of a more balanced fertilizer option, and then has microbial life in it as well, and because it is an insect manure, essentially. That's what frass is, and it contains high levels of chitin, and so potentially that chitin could help with disease resistance. So it's not going to hurt to use it. I wouldn't use it as my main form of integrated pest management, but having it in your mix is certainly not going to hurt anything, and it has all those other benefits. So insect frass, one of my favorite amendments right now. Okay, moving on. Blood meal. Blood meal is a very fast release available form of nitrogen. It's kind of gross to work with. You want to keep it very dry until you're ready to use it. But if you need nitrogen, it's a good way to get faster release nitrogen right away. And so this goes back to that whole idea of utilizing slaughterhouse products. The reason you might want to consider it is because you are closing an ecological loop. This would be the best use case for that material, is to grow more things with it rather than it ending up in a landfill or getting dumped or polluting our environment by ending up in our streams or something, our water supply or something like that. So by extracting and making a fertilizer out of it, that's really the highest use case for a product like this. But again, I understand if there's people that don't want to use it. Now, I have seen research, and there's not a ton of research on this topic, unfortunately, but the research that I have seen that does exist shows that the blood meal is actually very clean. So it doesn't have high levels of heavy metals. It doesn't have high levels of any sort of like growth hormones, pesticides, you name it. It's actually a very clean product. Same with the bone meal as well, which I'll get to. But yeah, it's definitely something that you should consider. And you also will pick up a little bit of iron from it too, because it is actual blood. So that's another nitrogen source. Again, I don't use it in my garden all that often, but I don't have a problem with people that do choose to use it. It is a good option. Okay, moving on. So I have a couple things in here that aren't necessarily NPK, but I had already poured them into the bucket, so I'm going to talk about them. This is agricultural sulfur. So agricultural sulfur is these little tiny prilled pellets in this case. You can add it to your soil as a way of lowering your pH. And so if you have a pH above, let's say 7.3, 7.4, and you need to lower it, this is a good option. It's not going to be immediate. It's going to take a little bit of time. So keep that in mind as well. But it is a good way to slowly lower your soil pH. In addition to that, sulfur is associated with a lot of terpene production. So having adequate sulfur is really important to get all the flavors and odors that you want in whatever sort of flower that you're growing. So keep that in mind. And it's really hard to get too much sulfur. Now, the only risk with sulfur is raising the EC, the electrical conductivity of your soil, so high that you may put osmotic pressure on your plant roots. But you're not going to see a sulfur toxicity in cannabis. It's very tolerant of high sulfur, so I don't usually worry about that. Next, and again, this one, I kind of poured it out before I decided to do primarily NPK, but I'm going to leave it in here. This is biochar. So talking about biochar, it is one of my favorite amendments. It's right up there with insect frass. I include it in all of my soil formulations. And the reasons why are because it has a ton of benefits. It's going to sequester carbon. It helps with overall plant growth and yield. It's habitat for microbes. It sequesters heavy metals. It does just a ton of really great things. And we found that using it at a rate of about 5 to 8% by volume, we see better growth and yield. And I was kind of surprised by this. I didn't expect to see such a dramatic difference by such a small addition, but the research really supports it. And one thing to keep in mind, and this is something I'll talk more in depth about when I talk about compost, but not all biochar is created equal. And so you want to make sure that you're sourcing it from a company that's burning clean wood and actually pyrolyzing that material. That means burning it at very, very high heat and low oxygen conditions. Otherwise, what you're ending up with is something more like ash that can contain heavy metals and other contaminants. So having a very consistent, clean source is super important. And then particle size plays a big role too, like I talked about with surface areas. So having some smaller particle sizes, it can act as an aggregate in your soil and give your soil more tilth, more texture. So the size that we use is fairly small. It's not a powder. It's probably I would say the size of like maybe like a grain of rice, to give you sort of a size analogy. Okay, moving on here. Let's see. Believe this is feather meal. The feather meal is sourced from, as you can expect, from the poultry industry. Feather meal can contain more contaminants than the bone or the blood, but in general is another great option for nitrogen sources. I'd originally read that feather meal was a slow release nitrogen source, but what I'm finding in practice with soil testing and things like that is it comes down more to particle size, at least in this case. So yeah, again, it's primarily nitrogen. And there are other options if you choose not to use, anything from the slaughterhouse industry. Okay, let's see here. This is crab or crustacean meal, and crab and crustacean meal is a good source of nitrogen as well. It's also going to contain high levels of chitin from the shells that's in there. It's going to contain some more calcium for the same reason. And I haven't talked about calcium. You will get some calcium from the insect frass as well. And just to go back to the insect frass, depending on what insect it was, whether it was mealworm or black soldier fly, I think there's even a cricket frass that's commercially available now. They're all going to be slightly different NPK, slightly different microbial consortia, different calcium levels, those sorts of things. But yeah, keep that in mind. So anyway, getting back to the crustacean meal, this is going to be a combination of a variety of different crustaceans, typically crab, lobster, those sorts of things, and it's just ground up. And so you can add this to your soil, again, primarily for nitrogen. Okay, kelp meal, what we have here. Now, kelp meal is an interesting one because it has a ton of plant benefits. There's a lot of great research on how wonderful kelp meal is for plant growth and plant health. It contains like 70 different elements in it. It's pretty phenomenal. Kelp is this amazing dynamic accumulator. Now, because it is so good at accumulating nutrients, primarily micronutrients, it is also high in heavy metals, primarily arsenic from what I've seen on tests. So you can use it. I like to use it at lower rates now, especially for people in states where heavy metals is a concern. But if we just look at it from a plant growth perspective, it is a wonderful input and something to use in your soil. So just keep that in mind. If you do use it, you can use it at pretty low rates. You don't necessarily need to use the high rates that we originally were using when we were making Coots mix. Okay, this next one is known as K-Mag or Sulpomag or sulfate of potash magnesia. It has a bunch of different names. It's going to be very high in sulfur, potassium, and magnesium, and it's not going to be in the right ratios for what you want of those elements. So keep all of that in mind if you decide to use it. There are rare use cases where I might use it, but I don't use it all that frequently. Typically, and the reason for this is because I have access to things like potassium sulfate and magnesium sulfate, Epsom salt, which are both very, very affordable, and I can control the levels of potassium and magnesium I'm adding separately. It's kind of like using CalMag. Like I would never use CalMag because I'd want to add calcium and magnesium separately and at different ratios depending on what my soil report or what my plant may need. So it's the same sort of thing with Sulpomag or K-Mag. That being said, you know, if you do need to pick up some potassium and a little bit more on the magnesium side, then it is a good option for you. So just keep that in mind. The one other thing about it is it's very soluble, which I like, so you will get a faster release rate with it. And with these particular amendments, particularly anything that's a sulfate here like these, they are refined, but they are approved for use in organic production. So something like the potassium sulfate, these are mined products that are then refined and then allowed to be used if you have a soil test showing a deficiency. So really all of these products to a certain extent have some level of processing or refinement that happens in order to get to the final product. You know, in this case it's pelletized, in these cases they're made into meals. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about an amendment and deciding whether or not you want to use something in your garden. So next we have potassium sulfate. This is 0050, it's 50% potassium. Really easy way to get available potassium, and that's so important mid to late flower. That's what's really going to bulk up your flower, give you that nice density that you want. You know, I see these PK boosters and stuff on the market in the cannabis industry, and I think a lot of that really probably comes down to people having inadequate calcium, either from overwatering because it's highly leachable. So if you're flushing your soils and watering your soils to run off a lot, you could be removing nitrates and potassium, and so later in flower you may need to add some more. Or it's just one of those things that your plant is utilizing it at a fairly high level, and so you want to make sure you always have adequate potassium in there. And this is one of the easiest ways to get it in an organic system is through potassium sulfate. So week 3 is a nice time to do a light potassium sulfate application, and that would just be mixed with water and watered in. And it's pennies, so it's very affordable input. Next we have magnesium sulfate or Epsom salts. Rarely do I need to add magnesium. I find with most living soils, we have adequate magnesium already. But if I ever do see it as soil report or need to add it, Epsom salt's the easiest way to do it because it's very soluble. I can just water it in. I'm not using very much. And it's very easy to source. So it's a wonderful option for you if you do need to pick up magnesium in your garden. Okay, moving on. So this was crab meal. You know, this one, this is fishbone meal. Sorry, they look very similar here, and I put them all out, and I didn't label them, so I'm trying to test myself to see if I can do it all visually. Fishbone meal is again, it's from the commercial fishing industry. It's high in phosphorus, but you're also picking up some nitrogen with it. So you want to just be aware of that. With the phosphate in it, it's a good way to pick up phosphorus. It's not perfectly clean on heavy metal tests from what we've seen. So unfortunately, there really is not a perfect phosphorus source that either isn't going to give you calcium or potentially bring in some heavy metals. So just keep that in mind. Now, there's certainly ones that are cleaner than others, and there's one that I'm getting tested right now that I'm super excited about that may actually be the holy grail of phosphorus inputs that's derived from algae, but I haven't gotten the test back yet. I'll keep you guys posted. In the meantime, we do like to use fishbone meal. So your options for phosphorus in organic systems are fishbone meal, bone meal, and soft rock phosphate. Those are going to be your main sources. And I'll talk about the other two next here. But yeah, fishbone meal, again, sourced from the ocean, not as clean as some people may make it out to be, actually. I think the bone meal is actually cleaner when we talk about heavy metals and we talk about, things like growth hormones, pesticides, fungicides, all those things. It's not in the bone meal, so you don't have to worry about it. There's no GMOs making it into the bone meal. There's research that shows that doesn't happen. So things from the ocean, not necessarily cleaner than things from the land if we're talking about products like this. Now, manures, on the other hand, and compost, absolutely, you're going to see higher levels of contaminants in those. So we'll get to that. But bone meal was the next one. This is it here. One concern that people have with bone meal is mad cow's disease. It really hasn't been an issue, but it is a prion. It is something where if I am using, any of these amendments, I'm going to wear a mask and wash my hands and things like that. But statistically, you're more likely to get in trouble driving your car or doing your daily tasks than you would from that. But that is one fear I've heard associated with bone meal, so I just wanted to bring it up. So yeah, we have bone meal, fishbone meal, and then lastly, soft rock phosphate. Now, soft rock phosphate is a mined product, and so it is going to contain higher levels of heavy metals. So keep that in mind. This particular one that I have here is CalPhos. It's one of the cleaner soft rock phosphates that I've seen. It is a larger particle size here, so the availability is going to be a little bit slower. So we usually use a combination of the fishbone and the soft rock, the CalPhos, in our mixes. There are other ones like Fertilizer that we've tested, and they have higher levels of heavy metals. So we primarily recommend the ones that we found have lower levels of heavy metals. If that makes sense. So that's sort of the overview of NPK. And again, this is not exhaustive. This doesn't have everything, but this is the majority of what you'll see in your amendments. So I'm going to clear these out. I'm going to replace them with some other amendments, and I'm going to continue the video here shortly. All right, I'm back, and I've got a new set of amendments laid out here, but I want to start off talking about limes. Now, because limes all look relatively the same, I didn't bother putting them out. It just looked like a whole bunch of white flour laying out here. But I want to talk about the differences because it's really important to get the right lime or the right calcium amendment into your soil for the effect that you're looking for. So the first one I want to talk about is agricultural lime. Now, agricultural lime is great if you want to raise your soil pH. It's primarily calcium carbonate, so it will have a dramatic impact on soil pH. So if you're low, this is the way to go. And again, the ones that we like to use are a very, very fine flour. That's going to impact your release rates, but you could consider using different particle sizes to get different release rates on the calcium. But calcium is one of the most important things to preload and have high levels through veg and flour. So that's agricultural lime. Next I have Dolomite lime. Now, Dolomite lime is calcium and magnesium carbonate. So what this does is this is going to have an even greater effect on raising soil pH, but in addition to that, it's going to provide you with magnesium. Now, what I found is in most cases when you're mixing soils, you have adequate magnesium and you don't need to add it. So I rarely use Dolomite lime because I prefer, again, I think I talked about this before, but I prefer to add my magnesium and my calcium as separate amendments. and in the correct ratios that I'm aiming for, and Dolomite does not do that. So there are some rare cases where we might use Dolomite lime if we need to raise soil pH, add calcium and magnesium. Then it is a viable option. But other than that, it's not a terribly popular amendment that I like to use a lot. So one of my favorite calcium amendments is gypsum, also known as calcium sulfate. So the great thing about gypsum is it buffers soil pH and that it's not going to have a dramatic impact on it. So the calcium being a cation and the sulfur being an anion, they offset each other and you end up with a relatively neutral impact on your overall soil pH. So why is this important? Well, if your soil pH is already 6.8 to 7.2, let's say, and you don't want to go any higher, then you can add gypsum to your soil to get more calcium in there. And the nice thing about it also is the fact that you're also picking up sulfur, and you really don't have to worry too much about a sulfur toxicity. The other cool thing about gypsum is the solubility level of it. Frankly, it's just not terribly soluble. So the solubility of it, the release rate of gypsum is relatively slow, meaning it's going to give you pretty optimal release rates of calcium throughout the growth cycle. So if you're starting out and mixing a soil, and you're starting with peat moss, for example, that has a very low pH, you'll typically add something like the egg lime and the gypsum. So you get different forms of calcium in there. This is going to raise your pH. This is going to not raise your pH, but give you release of calcium throughout the entire cycle. So those work well. Now, some people have recommended using oyster shell flour. It looks very similar to the agricultural lime and frankly the gypsum. The difference there is it's derived from oyster shells, but it's also a mined product. These are bed deposits that are mined. It's not like they're pulling this out of the ocean and getting you like the oyster shell flakes that you might have used if you had chickens, for example. So it's also primarily just calcium carbonate as well with a little bit of impurities. So if you cannot find agricultural lime affordably, then this is a good alternative for you, but I wouldn't go out of my way to try and find oyster shell flour to replace agricultural lime, as they're going to have very similar effects. Again, it's going to raise soil pH and provide you with high levels of calcium. And then lastly here, I have wollastonite. That's calcium silicate. Now, wollastonite's a little bit harder to find for folks, but if you are able to find it, it's a wonderful option and something I definitely like to include. So if I was formulating an ideal soil mix, I would use a combination of gypsum and wollastonite with probably a little bit of agricultural lime. Now, the big difference here is you're getting silica, which has a ton of plant benefits. I know I've talked about it in the past. It really is the magical nutrient element when it comes to growing plants. Silica helps with drought stress. It helps with disease resistance. It helps with thicker cell walls. It helps mitigate micronutrient toxicities if you have a little too much boron or a little bit too much manganese in your soil. It just has so many different benefits for plants. Now, all that being said, calcium silicate will give you that calcium and also silica, so it's a wonderful option. Now, it does raise soil pH, but much slower than agricultural lime. So if I have a soil test that shows a very low soil pH, let's say it's like 5.5 or 6, I'm like, wow, I got to get this up before, right away for this next cycle. I'm not going to use wollastonite. I'll use agricultural lime or oyster shell flour as something that's going to raise my pH much faster. But if your soil pH is close to being in range, you just want a little bit of upward pressure on your pH, then wollastonite is a wonderful, wonderful option to consider. So those are your limes. Let's talk compost next. So not all composts are created equal. I could do a whole thing on compost. Let me know in the comments below if that's something that people are interested in. But the way the compost is made, what the feedstock is, how that compost is treated can have dramatic impacts on the biological and chemical and physical properties of that compost. So there's a lot of different types of compost. Out there, you'll see different ways of making it. The main three forms of compost are static composting. That's where you throw stuff in a pile and let it sit for a year or two and it just breaks down slowly. The advantage of that, very little labor. The disadvantage, it's not going to kill off weed seeds, it's not going to kill off pathogens. The next option is vermicomposting or worm castings, and I'll show you some examples of those here, and I'll put them up on the screen here. I'll supersede it over the video hopefully so you guys can see some close-ups of what I'm talking about. But worm casting is where you use worms to break down the material. It's called vermiculture or vermicompost. The castings is essentially worm poop. And those tend to be some of the highest quality from a biological perspective. Worms are just very good at breaking things down into a very plant available and plant friendly forms. But the last form, oh, and I want to mention that worm castings do not, they do not kill weed seeds and they do not kill pathogens. So the one option that does do those things is thermophilic composting or thermocomposting. That's where you heat a compost up by balancing the carbon to nitrogen ratios to 161 degrees for 48 hours and then, above 141 degrees but below 165, I believe, is the current standards for composting. And that thermal process and turning the pile will allow for the aerobic microorganisms to create this exothermic reaction. It heats up the pile as they reproduce rapidly, and that kills off the weed seeds and kills off the pathogens in there. So optimally, and it's very hard to find commercially, you would do a combination of these things where you would take a compost, you would thermally heat it, you would then let some worms work through it, or maybe statically compost the material longer after it's gone through this thermal process. And that's going to create your most biodiverse, high quality compost from a biological perspective. Now, what's available commercially for compost is mostly worm castings and thermal composts because of that pathogen requirement that you usually have to deal with. So what I find on the market typically for commercial compost is pretty poor. And so I've searched around our area to see what's available, and in the Northwest, these are the best composts that I've found. So the first one is this Ole Mountain fish compost. It's a 2-year aged fish compost. It's a very dark, rich color to it. It has a fair amount of nitrogen. It's reasonably low in heavy metals. They do use a little bit of post-consumer waste, so there's yard waste in there, unfortunately. So I will on occasion come across little bits of plastic or other things in the compost. But the big thing that they do well, I think, and frankly the quality has gone down a little bit in the last few years, I feel like, is they age the compost for a minimum of 2 years after thermally composting it. And that's the key difference, I think, in quality, because a lot of the commercial composts that you see on the market are really only composted for like 60 to 90 days. They're turned really quickly. And so you just don't end up with something that's necessarily a finished product. And that can cause issues with there being high levels of ammonium, the nitrogen still cycling. The biological communities in those composts are just not as evolved or as beneficial for plants. So if you can, find yourself a high quality compost. And as a side note, if you're formulating a soil mix, it should always start with the compost. These recipes I see online where people just list a bunch of ingredients, those recipes, your results are going to vary absolutely, because everyone's compost source is different, and compost brings in a fair amount of fertility, and so you need to account for that when you're mixing and formulating a soil mix. So that's the Ole fish compost. One that we discovered in the last couple of years is this Lane compost. They are out of Oregon. I'm really excited about it. I really like the look of the compost, and what we've done with them is they have a fish compost as well. I really like fish composts in general, but they can be high in heavy metals. So what we've done with the Lane compost is we've taken their garden compost and their fish compost. We have it specially blended just for us at 50-50, and we've had that tested for heavy metals and for fertility, and then we've created soil mixes around that blend. And this is something that I like because it's significantly lower in heavy metals, and we're seeing good overall plant growth and health from using the laying compost. Again, they do use a small amount of post-consumer waste, but I think less than what I see in the Oli. Either that or they're filtering it a lot better. But I tend to like this compost myself a little bit better than the Oli. So this is sort of my go-to for the most affordable, high-quality compost I've seen available here in the Northwest. And we do sell all of these composts on our website if you can't find something locally that you want to use in your garden. The next one that I have is the highest quality commercial compost that I've found. It's called Seacoast compost. They're actually doing a biodynamic process, which you can read about. It's a variety of different preps that they do specifically for their compost. They do also use fish products to make this compost, and there is no post-consumer waste, so you don't have to worry about plastics or any sort of trace residues of things that gardeners might have thrown in their yard bin that may not have broken down as rapidly as you may have liked. So that's where the Seacoast compost shines. And for our cannabis growers that are in regulated states for heavy metals, we now do a blend with this compost because it is by far the lowest heavy metal compost that we've found on the market. So it's a wonderful alternative. It's just more expensive. It costs us more to ship it here because they're a small outfit on the coast of the Oregon coast. So the shipping cost is higher, and the cost of the compost for them to make it and produce it is higher too. So if you have a little more room in your budget and you are concerned about heavy metals or plastics and things like that, this is a wonderful option. It's what I'm currently using in my garden since we've discovered it and started formulating with it over the last couple of years. All right, so moving on to worm castings. So we call this our fungal compost. This is really a worm castings product though. We take a combination of a few different worm castings and composts. We add nutrients to it, things like organic alfalfa meal, for example, as a way of awakening and invigorating the biology, specifically the fungal communities in the soil. And then we use this for making compost tea. Now, we call it a fungal compost, but it contains all sets of microorganisms, and it's something that that we really like using, like I said, in compost tea. But you can also top dress your plant with it and things like that as a way of increasing your soil biology. So that's what this product is. Now, we do have a worm castings that is made from African worm castings, and this is the most visually appealing compost worm castings I've ever seen. The African worms take a little bit larger poop, and so you have these little tiny, very rich, fertile balls that you can see, and I'll try and put a photo up of it. But this is a very clean, nice looking compost that is made from African worms that is really great. It has good biological activity, and we've used it for years. Similar to the fungal compost. In fact, this makes up a portion of our fungal compost recipe. Okay, so again, to recap, if you're thinking about a compost, do your research. Get a chemical analysis from the company, get a heavy metal analysis, find out exactly what's in it, ask them what they're using to make the compost, and make sure that what you're starting with is high quality. The compost fraction, I can't emphasize enough just how important it is. Okay, moving on though to what I have in front of me here. This is kind of what's left of amendments. I have on this side some blended craft fertilizers, and then over here I have some trace minerals and just a few things that I didn't get to talk about in the last video because I ran out of space. So let's start with the trace minerals. So first one over here, this crazy looking blue crystals. This is copper sulfate. So copper sulfate is a great option if you need to raise copper levels in your soil. If you do, you're using the tiniest amount of this stuff. We're talking fractions of teaspoons in most cases for home growers because it's highly concentrated, and you don't want to overdo it. Now, there is good research to show high levels of copper will help with some disease pressures, apparently, on the pathogen side. But again, with all of these trace minerals, I would say be very, very careful. In fact, with our soil testing analysis that we offer through KiS, we don't automatically give trace mineral recommendations. And the reason for this is because we typically don't see deficiencies in living soils related to trace minerals. It's usually something more like their watering or your macronutrients, nitrogen, potassium, calcium, phosphorus, those sorts of things that you're going to see issues with. So rarely is it trace minerals. And once all of those things are dialed, or if we get a leaf tissue analysis that definitely shows us that we have a trace mineral deficiency, then we'll begin to address it. Now, some people don't want to use this because it's blue crystals. It's obviously been refined and processed. It is approved for use by the National Organic, the NOP, the National Organic Program, for organic production if you can show you have a deficiency based off a soil test. Now, for those people that don't want to use something like that, hold on, let me show you what else there is. So there are products like this product here. So this is a liquid fertilizer. This is Biomin boron. And so what they're doing is they're taking that copper sulfate, they're chelating it, so bonding it with like an amino acid or some other organic molecule, and then essentially selling it to you as a lower concentration, in this case liquid form, of copper. So you would use this at slightly higher rates so it's easier to dose. And there's a number of companies that offer products like this. I just happen to have the Biomin one with me, but you can find that. So that is another alternative. Again, also approved for use in organic production. Okay, moving on to manganese. Now we have started adding manganese to our recommendations in very low doses. It's one of the safer trace minerals to add. So if you were going to go down the route of trace minerals, I would start with manganese. Now, these are two different options for manganese. You can see one's a very fine powder and one is a little tiny ball, essentially. Now, for these sorts of amendments, if you're adding them to soil, I like to mix them with water and then water them in to get a more even application, because again, we're talking parts per million on these things. So we use the powder primarily, and I think for my last soil run, I added 2 teaspoons per yard of soil. So again, like I said, very small amounts. All right, so moving on here, this is zinc sulfate. Same sort of thing as the others, it's just a white powder. You would use it in very, very small amounts. Next we have iron sulfate or ferrous sulfate. Now, iron is tough because iron is just not available in the pH ranges that that our plants are going to be happy in. Iron becomes most available, I think, in a pH around of 4 to 4.5, which frankly is not practical for growing plants. Once you get to higher levels, it oxidizes almost immediately. So there are some ways around this. You could, Bryant, Soil Doctor Consulting, he's talked about creating little pockets in the soil near the plant roots where you put a bunch of iron sulfate in there together as a way of maybe allowing plants to access iron. When we see low iron, that's where you see a lighter yellow color around the growing center of the plant. Plants will typically outgrow it, so I rarely do a lot in regards to addressing iron, just because it is so tricky in that regard, and we seem to hit sufficiency already in most cases. But one of the ways that you can look to do that is through iron sulfate. Okay, so I think that's the main trace minerals other than boron. I don't have boron in front of me, but it's going to look very similar to the zinc sulfate. It's a white powder. Boron is one you want to be especially careful with. It is needed for plant processes, but in very, very low rates. And so we rarely add boron. And if you do, be aware that there's a big difference between borax, which you can find in the grocery store. People use it for laundry and cleaning. Solubor, which I believe is like 6 to 8 times stronger levels of boron. So you want to make sure you're adjusting your application rates accordingly. Or something like this, which I think is only like 6 to 8% boron. So again, just make sure you don't over apply boron, because some of these trace minerals can actually cause soils to be infertile or inhospitable to plants by overdoing it. Okay, moving on to mineral applications in the form of like rock dust and these other products. So first off, we have Jersey green sand. I believe it's higher in potassium. Now, as a general rule with these rock dusts, I first started using these at fairly high rates because of the work of Steve Solomon and Clackamas Coote saying that trace minerals are really important to plants, and we want to make sure to have good levels in there by getting a lot of natural rock dust and things like that into our soil. So originally I was using these products more. I've since backed off quite a bit for a few reasons. One, they're really heavy, like shockingly heavy. I mean, it's rock dust. So they're gonna raise the weights of your soil, which for us is big because we're shipping soil in some cases to people. So if we can lower our weights, that's good. The biggest reason though is because of heavy metals. All of these rock dusts, anything that's derived from, that's mined, is going to have levels of heavy metals, and rock dusts are going to have it in higher levels than some of these other products like gypsum and things like that. So where the rock dust is mined from will have a dramatic impact on the chemical composition of the rock dust. So of the rock dust that we sell and use, the one that I like the best is this basalt. And it has the lowest levels of heavy metals. It's paramagnetic. Some people believe that that has plant growth properties or plant health properties. If I were to use a rock dust, that's the one that I would use. And again, I was using them at much higher rates. I don't use them at nearly the rates I used to anymore. And the other thing with this, and something I've learned from working with a lot of soil scientists and expert agronomists from the podcast, is that these rock dusts are not typically very plant available in the period of time that we want results in. So we're talking months to years, to potentially decades for some of these things to break down, whereas we have access to other ways to get these minerals much, much faster, with release rates that we can understand and control a lot better. So of the minerals and rock dust and things that you see here, I have glacial rock dust, which again, fine powder. Especially important, I think, with these rock dust is the particle size and surface area in terms of how quickly microbes can break them down. So if you can get a much finer powder or a micronized version, it's going to be much more available than larger chunks or larger particulate size. We also have azomite. That's a luminous silicate. That's also a mined product. Not something that I use. I know some growers really like it. It's just, I think there's better ways to get trace minerals than azomite, and it will bring in other things that you may not want, like aluminum and other heavy metals. Let's see here. Oh, here, this was the example of the African worm castings that I actually put into a thing here. So let's see, moving on. Okay, humates. This is from a company called Live Earth. This is a mined product as well. Humates are humic acids, and humates are, in theory, what happens when a plant material is broken down through that composting decomposition process. And what is left at the end is higher in chelation, properties, so it's better able to bond with other minerals and nutrients, and has a variety of plant properties. Now, most humic acid products are they're mined typically extracted from leonardite, which is a particular rock or mineral. There are other ones that are derived from plants, but yeah, that's essentially what you're looking at there. There is a lot more research in the last decade around humic substances and their plant benefits. I would throw the caveat out there that you do have levels of humic substances if you're using compost already. You may see benefit to adding more, but the research that I've seen is a bit varied. So it's not something that I use a ton of, but I do appreciate that there is research to support the use of humic substances in your garden, and I am hoping to get an expert on to talk more in depth about it here in the future. Okay, next I have malted barley. So the idea behind malted barley grain is that, and this is all from Clackamas Coon. This is where this all started. It's that the nutrients, all the nutrients that a plant needs is contained in the seed. And if we take that seed and we sprout that seed and then arrest that sprouting process, that's what essentially malting is that we use for beer making and other beverages. Essentially what that does is that stops that enzymatic process at its highest level. So when we originally started, what Coot had everyone doing was sprouting seeds and then grinding them up and then applying that as a way to raise the enzymatic levels in your soil and pick up a variety of different enzymes. Now we've since moved on to the malting. This is just much simpler and easier, and it's done professionally for you consistently, because if you let the seed go too long or you don't apply it right away, you can end up with alcohols or other things that could damage your plant. Now, I did some research, I did some trials, sorry, I didn't do research. I did some trials with this in my garden, and I didn't get the plant response that other people have claimed they've gotten. So it's not something that I use, but again, I just want to share why growers are doing it and the theory behind why they might use it. I would love to see some actual research come out on this in the future, but that's where the malted grain comes in, and that's why people use it. And so essentially you would just grind it up in a blender and then top dress it, water it in over the top, and you should see better overall plant growth and plant health. And some people claim their plants just explode in growth. Again, I did not get that response myself, but that doesn't mean it's going to be the same for everybody. Okay, corn gluten meal. I just threw this one in here. It really doesn't belong. I just forgot to do it in the last video, and I had some. It's not something we sell a lot of. You will see it sold in big box stores as a weed, a pre-emergent. So when corn gluten meal, it's hard to say, is applied to lawns at the right time in the spring, it can help prevent weed seeds from germinating. So it does have some of those properties, but it is also a source of nitrogen. So I just want to mention it, but it's not one that I recommend or use a lot. Okay. So now what I have left here are all various blends of organic amendments. And sometimes that's easier for folks. You know, if you don't want to go through the trials and tribulations of mixing your own, and you want something that you know is going to be consistent or give you an expected response, this is a good option for folks. So the first one I have here, this is what we call our microbe catalyst. This does have some nutrient level or fertilizer level in it, but what we use this for is, after testing a variety of different recipes and products, we ended up using this microbe catalyst as essentially a microbe catalyst. So when we make compost teas, for example, in a 5-gallon brewer, we would use a half a cup of this with a tablespoon of organic alfalfa as our food source, and we get a much better overall growth of microbes across all sets of microorganisms, and better diversity in biomass than if we were just using molasses. That being said, if you live somewhere where you have easy access to organic blackstrap molasses, that is another alternative that you can use for making compost tea. Molasses is also sticky, it's hard to deal with. This is just much easier, and so that's one of the other reasons that we really like it. So that's the microbe catalysts that we produce. Next one I have here, this lighter colored one, is our bloom booster. That's this product right here. The KiS Bloom Booster is something that Andrew on our team worked really dedicated 2 years almost in formulating to get just the right ratios of organic amendments to give us the highest levels of available P and K, just a little bit of nitrogen, and then the absolute cleanest heavy metals report in regards to organic bloom boosters that I've seen on the market. It's so clean on heavy metals. So if you are worried about heavy metals, which frankly it's something I think everyone should be thinking about, or if you're in a regulated state where you're tested for heavy metals, this is a wonderful option. All right. So this product here, this is Solomon's Mix. And what this is Steve Solomon's recipe for making a complete organic fertilizer. Now, one thing I want to mention with this is designed for growing nutrient-rich, mineral-dense vegetables. It's not made for maximizing your cannabis harvest or yield. And Steve acknowledges that. So it doesn't have the same ratios or levels of fertility as some of the other ones I'm going to talk about here, but what it will do is it will give you much higher levels of trace minerals. Steve is a big proponent of using these trace minerals in low levels as a way of raising the overall nutrition of the food. And while there isn't a ton of research on this topic, there are a lot of growers that are using this for their vegetable gardens. If they aren't doing soil testing, this is sort of his best guess recipe for what he thinks your garden might need. So that's the Steve Solomon COF. Now this is our mineral mix. This is if you want to get a combination of these limes and some rock dust and those sorts of things without buying all the individual products. So if you want to get some calcium as well as some trace minerals in the form of rock dust, again, rock dust are not my favorite, but we do make this product and it is available for people who are looking for something like that. So for example, if you had a garden and you already had the macronutrients and you just wanted to add some more trace minerals and you weren't in a rush for them to be immediately available to your vegetable garden, for example, this is an option in that regard. And then this last one here, this is our nutrient pack. This is where we started as a company. I formulated this, and we've made little tweaks to it, but I formulated this probably about 15, 20 years ago now. And what this is the nutrient portion of our soil mix for our water only and our biochar soils. So if you can't, or if shipping soil to you is not practical because you're on the other side of the country, for example, and you can mix your own soils, but you don't want to guess at the minerals and nutrients that your plant might need, this is a great way to do that. So we have a whole example on the page of a walkthrough how you would use this product. It can be top dressed similar to our bloom booster, and both of these products are registered for use in organic production for folks. And this is something that we took a long time to come up with. So if you're re-amending your soil or you're mixing new soils, this nutrient pack is a great option. And that's this product right here. Oh, it's heavy. There we go. Okay. So all that being said, I have a few other products kind of floating around here that I wanted to touch on before we go. So first off, I have this, this is from Dino-Myco. This is Mycorrhizal Fungi. Now I've done a lot of videos and I have a blog post on mycorrhizal fungi, but I want to talk a little bit about it in here because it's sort of part of what people do when they're growing plants. So mycorrhizal fungi is a particular species or classification of fungus that forms a symbiotic relationship with the roots of our plants. There are a variety of different species of mycorrhizal fungi, and they can be very plant specific. So for example, in this product, we have Glomus intraradices and Glomus mossiae. And those two have a relationship with fruit trees, cannabis, most vegetables, not brassicas though. And the way you would use this would be a one-time application directly to your roots of your plant when the plant is young. So for things like lettuces, I probably wouldn't bother with it. For things like tomatoes, peppers, maybe your cannabis plant, what you'll see by adding a product like this is higher uptake of phosphorus and other nutrients, better drought resistance, and ability to cope with different environmental abiotic stresses. So mycorrhizal fungi is great. The one thing about it is for people who are concerned about heavy metals in regulated states, I've kind of shied away from this because there is research that shows that mycorrhizal fungi will increase the uptake of heavy metals, which makes sense because it increases the uptake and flow of nutrients into the plant. This is a very mutualistic relationship that it has with your plant and your plant roots. So that's the one use case where I wouldn't use it. Now, when shopping around for a mycorrhizal product, there's a few things to keep in mind. So you may look on the back and see propagules or CFUs or spore count. And that's where things get really confusing because there are different types of mycorrhizal fungi, like I mentioned. Some are endomycorrhizal fungi, which in the case of most of our plants, like fruit trees, vegetables, things like that, that's what we're looking for. And these Glomus species fall into that category. There are other mycorrhizal species that are ectomycorrhiza, and those actually form a sheath around the outside of the roots, whereas these infect inside the plant. You cannot see endomycorrhizal fungi on a plant root without staining the roots and looking with a microscope. I hear people say, oh, that's, they see, little white fuzziness around a healthy root and they say, oh, that has mycorrhizal fungi. That's not mycorrhizal fungi. That's just healthy root hairs in the case of vegetables, fruit trees, things like that. Now, if you have a conifer, then ectomycorrhiza is the type of mycorrhizal fungi that you want. And so when you look on some of these labels, you may see, in this case, we have 700 propagules per gram of Glomus intraradices. That's a pretty high level, assuming that this package contains what it says it does. And that's a whole nother thing within the gardening industry is you can't necessarily trust these labels to be accurate. Now I trust this company, but that doesn't mean there's research through the Oregon Department of Ag that shows that many of these companies and what they list on the labels are not always 100% what's actually in the product. But you may see one that shows 2 million spores or CFUs per gram of mycorrhizal fungi. But if it's ectomycorrhizal fungi, it's not going to form a relationship with your cannabis plant. And so you can't really count those towards you getting a good infection level. So it's important to buy the right type for the plant that you're growing. I can't emphasize that enough. Now, in addition to that, this product is Glomus intraradices, Glomus mossiae. You may find another product like Pumpkin Pro, for example, that may have Glomus intraradices, also called Rhizophagus irregularis, just to further complicate things. If it's made somewhere else by a different company that's producing it, it's going to be a slightly different strain. And when that happens, you may get slightly different results. So I did a whole podcast with the creator of this product. And one of the things that he talks about is the strain that they're using of Glomus intraradices was developed out of Israel. And it's it came from a very harsh environment. So it's very good at dealing with a variety of environmental conditions, including a lack of water, like drought stress, and things like that. So when you see any of these microbial products, what we're talking about here is, they're not going to be all the same, even if they have the same name like trichoderma. You're not necessarily getting the same strain or species of trichoderma if you're buying it from different companies. So you may have to try different ones to get different results. But you just have to keep in mind too that these will give you good results if you use them correctly, but it's important to do your research. Okay, enough on that. What else do we have here? Oh, so this is our Compost Tea kit. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Compost Tea. This is where our company started before I ever got into these amendments. I have a wonderful blog on Compost Tea if you want to read more about it, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Compost Tea is not a silver bullet, as some people may tell you, but what it does do is it increases the biological activity in your soil potentially because you're adding a lot more microbes, and it can increase nutrient cycling. I think that's the key thing to think about is increasing nutrient cycling in your soil. And so our kit, this is what we'd use in our 5-gallon microbiolator. It's compost, which contains the biology. Then we have the food source to feed that biology. It goes into the brewer, which creates the optimal environment for these microbes to reproduce. And then we take that tea and apply it to our soil or to our plants. Again, it's important to understand that compost tea is not the cure-all for everything, but in certain cases, people can get pretty dramatic results from it. It is going to give you a little bit of fertility, primarily nitrogen, when you add that. So it's something to account for too when you're making and using compost teas. Okay, this is egg sil 16H or potassium silicate. This is what many of the silica products on the market are derived from. This is just a powdered form, and the advantage being cost. So you could take this and make your own silica, your own gallon of silica out of a pound of this for pennies on the dollar compared to what they charge to give it to you in a fancy bottle. It's 32% potassium, negligible amount though when you think about how much you're using. So I would take something this size, add it to a gallon of water, and then shake it really well, and then use it at a rate of a teaspoon or two per gallon of water of that liquid concentrate that I've made. So again, you're not using very much, but this is a great way to get silica consistently into your plant. It's something you could water with every watering or every other watering throughout your plant's life cycle to get a lot of the benefits of silica. Let's see. So over here I have the Pacific Grow Oceanic Fish Hydrolysate. They also make a product called CFOS. The reason it's not sitting here is because I used it recently with my plants. It's going to be a little bit higher in phosphorus because it's stabilized with phosphoric acid. But fish hydrolysate, CFOS, these types of products are sort of your cheap bloom formula or grow formula, liquid formula. It's one of the few liquid products that I really like to have on hand because all the stuff I've talked about so far, it takes a little while. It can take 5 to 10 days for you to really see a plant response after fertilizing. And if you have a plant that's low in nutrients, we don't want to wait that long. We don't want to let it suffer for that long because that's going to impact its overall health, make it more susceptible to diseases, more susceptible to pests because it's stressed out, and it's going to impact our overall yield. So in those cases, if I see I have a nitrogen deficiency, for example, if I'm seeing a lighter yellow plant, yellowing leaves at the bottom, I'm going to hit it with something like this and maybe do a top dressing of a nitrogen amendment at the same time as a way to get some immediate end to the plant. And then I'll probably do a few feedings of something like this to kind of spoon feed it. Or the other way I use this or the CFOS is if I'm halfway through the cycle and I realized I under amended my plants, then I can kind of spoon feed them, essentially like I would if it was a bottled nutrient to get them through the rest of the growth cycle. Or if you have really little plants, seedlings, things like that, this is another great way to dose fertility at low levels for your plants. So the one bad thing about fish hydrolysate is it stinks. It smells like fish. It's a really strong smell. That's the one downside to these products. But other than that, I really like to use them. Microbial products. So we primarily are using microbial mass now, and actually the founder of Mammoth P, Colin Bell, who I've had on the podcast, a good friend of mine, he's over there at Microbial Mass too. And I actually knew the founders of Microbial Mass way back in the day when they first were getting started. and they're great folks. Mammoth Peat was sort of that first product on the market. They're actually no longer around. This is what's left of my supply, and I just had one here, so I thought I'd show it to you. But by adding specific microbes, in this case, P-solubilizing microbes, we're going to get better nutrient uptake. And there's actually a fair bit of research around using these sorts of microbial biostimulants that are very targeted versus something like Compost Tea, which is just a shotgun approach of microbes. We're just putting out all the microbes that were in the compost and seeing which ones the plant might want. Whereas here we're targeting it with very high concentrated levels of specific microbes that we know do specific things. Again, I'm showing you Mammoth Peat only because I'm using this up, and then I'll be switching over to microbial mass, which we do have available on our website. Let's see, what else? Okay, one last thing to talk about is silica. So I've already talked about the benefits of silica, but one of the things to know about silica is availability. And if you want to do a deep dive on this, I did a podcast with Dr. Wendy Zellner. She is a silica expert and explained it much better than I will in this video. But essentially there's 3 different sources of silica that we can use in our garden. And they have different availability to the plant. So the first one would be amorphous, and that's what this egg sil is. And it's it's one of the most plant available forms of silica because it converts it to silicic acid, and then the plant can take that up. The next one would be biogenic silica, and that would be something that just essentially is plant derived. So you hear of silica derived from rice hulls or from bamboo. That would be a biogenic source of silica. And the issue with that is just you may be picking up heavy metals, and it's not going to be as available as amorphous forms. And then the last form is quartz. And quartz is literally rock, and that's what these sorts of products are. And I'm not picking on this company. They're very nice. They sent me this product. The one problem I have with these products is we don't know when or how available they actually are. From my understanding from talking to Dr. Zellner is we're talking a period of months to years before this silica becomes available. And because there's so many variables in terms of when it would become available, like how much weathering has occurred, the particle size, the moisture level, the microbes in the soil, we really just don't know when we're going to be getting that silica or those trace minerals. So keep that in mind with products like this. Let's see. Okay, so I have a few IPM products that I just keep in my garden pantry, and so I just wanted to add those to the end of this video just because I like to use them. But before I do, I forgot about Diatomaceous Earth. I meant to put some in here. It's a white flower-looking product. There is actually good research that shows that Diatomaceous Earth will provide available silica. I believe it was Dr. Nicole Gauthier, apologies for that. Dr. Nicole Gauthier did research and showed a 70% reduction in powdery mildew by using Diatomaceous Earth and Wollastonite, I think, as SI sources. But again, I'm doing this off of memory, so I will have to double check that one. But that is another option for getting available silica. Okay, so moving on to IPM. What I have here, yellow sticky card. Most of you guys are familiar with these. What I wanted to share, and this particular one is from Catchmaster. I really like this brand, and I've talked to the owners of the company. The nice thing about this is it's the sticky cards have gotten a lot better. This adhesive, while sticky, it doesn't stay stuck to my hands. I don't end up with this glue that I'm like picking at on my fingers for the next day or so. If this gets in my hair, I can get it out pretty easily with a little bit of soapy water. Whereas some of the brands out there that use a lower quality adhesive will have issues in that regard. But it is enough to catch insects. So that's the key there. How much and what type of adhesive do you want to use to catch insects without being really hard to work with and things like that. So these cards, as you can see, they have, let's see if I can show you here. They have perforations on them. This is the backside of the card. the front side has the black better. Let me see if I can pull it off here. So you can see that there. This is for scouting, so you can keep track of what sort of insect pressure you have. You can use these cards for mass trapping, but the main benefit of these cards is not mass trapping. It's to keep track of what's in your garden right now. Is it a fungus gnat? Is it a root aphid? Is it a beneficial? Is it just not a pest at all, just something flying around that happened to get into my room? It's important to track these and change these out regularly. So I can't tell you how many grows I've gone into where these things are just covered with fungus gnats or they've been up for months. That doesn't give us any good information. You need to be changing these out consistently. So that's what these sensor cards are. Now, if you do need to do mass trapping, I'm only sharing this because some people weren't aware that this was a thing. You can buy the same material in these giant rolls. So you can string this across your whole garden. And this is for mass trapping. So if you just are trying to catch a lot of fungus gnats or root aphids or whatever flying winged pest that you have that's hitting your garden, this is what you want to use, something like this. So I'm only telling you so people know it's available. This would not be my only form of dealing with an insect infestation though either. This would be used in conjunction with something else. Now, laden flower, you can't spray. Maybe something like this comes more into play. Otherwise, mass trapping in conjunction with various sprays is a great way to help control these things. Or drenches, you know, we might use Bavaria, we might use Issaria. There's a number of microbial products that we can apply specifically for dealing with certain insect issues. But when it comes to sprays, I want to show you the two products that I keep in my garden and that I'm the most excited about. So the first one is this Monterey Horticultural Oil. This is also known as Sulfoil X. This is just the homeowner size. I don't need a giant size for my small garden. This is more than enough. And this is mineral oil based. Now, some people don't want a mineral oil based product, and I totally get that. Keep in mind though, with this product, there's a lot of good research in terms of what sort of residual it leaves behind, as well as what it's going to do. So this is primarily a suffocant. It's going to suffocate all the insects that it comes into contact with. So this is a really good knockdown spray, and you can also use it for dipping and a variety of other things without risking phytotoxicity. But for folks who don't want to deal with a horticultural oil or something that might be derived from mineral oil, this is a new product, and this is just a sample size here. That being said, this sample size is 3.6 fluid ounces. This is enough for 30 or 40 gallons of spray solution. Now, right now, product's called EpiShield. I probably should have led with that. It's from Bioworks. It is it's a really cool plant botanical product that they've created and formulated, and it uses much lower concentrations than any other botanical product on the market. So you have virtually no risk of phytotoxicity, and there's a ton of research behind it. So I normally don't get behind 25B products. These are products that are using ingredients that are shown to be exempt from the EPA registration list. And the reason why I don't like these is because anyone could mix something together and call it an insecticide, and if they're using 25B products, they can register it and sell it. Whereas there's a ton of research around EpiShield and data to support the efficacy of this product. And I'm hoping to have something this size available to you guys here really soon, because right now the only available sizes are quite large and much more than the average home grower would ever want or need. But this stuff smells amazing as well. So yeah, this is probably my new favorite go-to spray. Now, the one thing about that Dr. Michael Brownbridge was actually just telling me yesterday, Sulfoil X, or Monterey Horticultural Oil, is actually effective at dealing with the egg stage of thrips. Now, thrips lay their egg, they can lay their eggs actually inside the leaf tissue, and this will seem to block that little hole that allows them to breathe before they emerge from the leaf tissue. So that's where something like this would win out. We're not seeing that same effect with the EpiShield, but EpiShield has really good efficacy across almost all cannabis pests. So you can go to the website at BioWorks and check out the entire label on it there. But again, really excited about, and these are the two products that I like to use in my garden. So, all right, I think I covered the majority of organic inputs that you can find that are available for your garden. Of course, there's other ones out there. Feel free to ask any questions below in the comments, and I'm happy to try and answer them as well. But yeah, if you want to start playing around and mixing your own soils or utilizing organic amendments, this is a great way to get going. I hope that was helpful. Thanks, guys.